The cold scriptorium smells of damp wood and rancid candle oil. On the table are wax tablets, carefully smoothed with a bone stick, and next to them are scrolls with Latin glosses. A quill rustles across the parchment, and it becomes clear. This is neither a monastery chronicle nor a list of donations. These are scenes where adult women choose freedom of the body, not as promiscuity, but as the right to say no to coercion, where flesh is called a test of conscience, not a commodity. And the author is neither a court clerk nor a fair room singer, but a canoness from an imperial convent. In the 10th winter of the century, such a text is a risk, but the hand does not tremble. Where previous books were afraid of lust, this one writes about power over oneself. Dear audience, welcome. Write where you're looking from, and whether you've encountered texts where a woman's voice changes the rules of talking about the body. Leave comments. Your experience is important. Enjoy listening. We're going to take apart the figure of a canoness from an imperial abbey on the northern plains, known as Hrotsvitha of Gandersheim. Her plays sound like quiet confrontations in Latin lines. Not a street scandal, but the discipline of a scene where heroine martyrs refuse to be coerced, and violence is labeled not naturalistic, but the legal and spiritual vocabulary of the age. The myth that women were silent is here confronted with a document. Manuscripts, lists of books of the abbey, references at court, later copies, where both the scribe's hand and the trace of censorship are visible. To understand how this theater came into being, one must see the structure of life. The imperial abbey is not a closed cell, as the Romantics imagine it, but a complex institution. Canonesses live according to the statutes, but do not take perpetual vows as nuns, keep their property, correspond with the rulers, receive rents from villages and bridges. In such houses, imperial families enroll daughters, adult female relatives, and widows to serve the enlightenment and memory of the dynasty. Here neighbors a library, a scriptorium, a school of singing and counting, and, most importantly, the right to speak Latin about things on which honor and order depend. In this outline, Hrotsvitha takes the form of the ancient comedy writer, whose texts were copied with reservations in the monasteries, and unfolds it against the tempting manner of the laughing theater. She writes dramas, hagiographies, and epic chronicles of the deeds of sovereigns, combining piety with political loyalty and the stage with the preaching of self-ownership. Her dramaturgy is not about the fair or the domestic farce. They are productions for reading and perhaps for discreet representations in a sorority or before a small circle of guests during Lord's Days, where bishops, earls, and trusted ladies gather at court. The plays feature adult heroines who confront coercion not with heat but with clarity. Freedom of the body is presented as a duty of conscience, nonviolence as an act of faith and right. The sources of the era describe violence dryly, as an abuse of power, as a social fact leading to shame, fines, and repentance. Hrotsvitha doesn't relish the details, but names the consequences: dishonor, death, the breakdown of family unions, the disintegration of the credit of trust. She gives the viewer the tools to recognize not lust, but the attempt to substitute consent for coercion. Where the antique image of the lover played on a leash of laughter, here the heroine speaks indeed. She rejects the contract of the body, calling it a sin and a trap. The 10th century context is harsh to the weak and practical to the strong. The land groans with feudal bartering. Authorities shift with an unpredictability on which supplies of salt and candles depend. Disease comes in waves, fevers, bubonic plague breaks out in rare years, but the fear of sudden death lives in every text. Medicine lists herbs, poultices, bloodletting. Monastery medicine cabinets hold dried roots and ointments for boils, but more often they treat with regimen, warmth, silence, clean linen. In such a reality, the body is not a private toy, but a working tool of duty and prayer. A weak body ruins the routine, breaks the service, leads to a breakdown of rent and hang-ups in the chancery. That's why the plays, where adult women refer to power over themselves as strength, sound like a ministry of order rather than a challenge to pleasure. Hrotsvitha, living in a world where scandal is paid for by the community, shows that flesh can be a fortress, not a vulnerability. Her choice of form is also political. The ancient author to whom she responds is known for turning desire into play and coercion into a comic device. The monastic teachers copied him cautiously, supplying moralizing notes. Canonissa takes the structure of the scene, the rhythm and clarity of the dialogue, and forces them to serve a different thesis. Desire without freedom is not love but violence. Lust is not a ridiculous weakness, but the test on which family honor and civil peace are held. In her plays, the martyrs are adults. Their decision is not a caprice, but a conscious setting of boundaries. Yes to consent, no to coercion. She does not paint bloody pictures, but leaves traces, lists of fines, records of public repentance, references to the intervention of judges. In this way, women's theater becomes not a trace of emotion, but a legal declaration in a poetic frame. Secular power in this era looks closely at monasteries, especially imperial monasteries. Abbeys with immunity are the pillars of the dynasty. They pray for the sovereign, keep the archives, and supply the court with educated counselors and scribes. Hrotsvitha's plays do not circulate in the public square. They circulate in manuscripts that belong to the world of correspondence. The Abbey's book lists include Latin fathers, grammars, histories, and poetry. Her own texts are next to them. In some seasons, the manuscripts were read in the cloister, where it is cold and smells of damp stone. In others, they were read at court at quiet evenings, where the ruler's adult female relatives and trusted advisors gathered. There, these plays became a tool of education. Not fear, but an example of fortitude. The texts could be discussed from the standpoint of the propriety of the genre. Was it permissible for a woman to talk about flesh and desire, even if with the intention of instructing? The clergy argued, but where the abbot's statutes and the authority of the imperial family decided, the manuscript found a place on the shelf. The risk, however, did not disappear. Any attempt to talk about the body carried the danger of becoming an obscenity in the eyes of those who saw the subject as a threat itself. The mechanism of the accusation was simple: to refer to examples of ancient theater, to attribute to the author a fascination with the flesh, to declare female courage inappropriate. On the other hand, Hrotsvitha and her abbey held the trump card, a clear purpose for the text and a transparent method. Where the antique image of the libertine bred laughter, she places a hagiographic example next to it, without relegating the villainy to the ridiculous. Where the stage could have become a square, she leaves it a room for instruction, without spectacle, without bodily demonstration, without innuendo that feeds the crowd. That was her advantage. She wrote not for the bazaar, but for the scriptorium and the court, where the word is weighed by the seal. Behind the dry rhetoric is the everyday reality of the abbey. The canonesses are adults, firmly connected by kinship to noble houses, running the household, rents in grain, bridge tolls, overseeing the mill, caring for pilgrims. Any fame about obscene books hit the finances. Donations hung up. The parish slowed down deliveries. The city had an excuse to tighten fees. Therefore, the women's theater inside the walls takes care of the form. In the manuscript, clean margins, clear titles. In the lists, a note about the good intention. In the prefaces, an emphasis on the correction of vice through an example of fortitude, not because the author wants to hide, but because her task is not to shock, but to discipline. she puts the flesh in its place, under the responsibility of conscience and a woman's right to consent, and she does so in language that loves order. The myth of the silence of women's voices does not stand up to this accounting of paper. There are not only words here, but traces in inventories, records of parchment issued for a new play, inventories of candles for readings, names of scribes who made copies to eminent addressees. In one season at court, where the victories and marriages of the dynasty were remembered, the play might be read among adult noble ladies as part of a moral conversation, not about romance, but about duty and choice. In another season, the manuscript was taken to the cloister to instruct young canonesses, not to attract an audience, but to reinforce the habit of talking about the flesh, without shame and without acting. In both cases, the document, not the legend, shows a strong message. The female author did not violate the order, but rewrote its clause about the body. The handwritten bundles show the route by which texts from the woman's house go out into the world and back again, solidified by seals. In one scroll is a list of books that lists the canoness's plays next to the Latin Fathers. In another, an inventory of parchment issued for the composition of dramas. In a third, a guest register with notes on readings on ceremonial days. These meticulous records show how the stage was assembled without a square, not for laughter, but for discipline. The plays are structured as hagiographic probes of conscience for the adult heroines. They are offered deals, shared beds as part of patronage, a decent-looking contract in exchange for silence. The heroines refuse, and the refusal is framed as an act with consequences. Breaking patronage, threats, attempts to discredit. Violence is mentioned as an abuse of power that hits home and community. There are no details, just a dry accounting of damage and risk. The text resounds with the technique of confrontation. Not to let shame become an argument, not to surrender the body to the rhetoric of someone else's right, to hold the boundary of consent. This logic works not only within the plays, but also around them. The scriptorium is careful. The prefaces emphasize the moralizing purpose. The abbot's charter is the right of the canonesses to teach the young, using the example of the steadfastness of adult martyrs. The household of the monastery makes this scene necessary. The economic book stretches lines about rents from villages, tolls from bridges and mills, expenses for candles, wax, oil, and the treatment of adult sisters and servants. Each winter brings sickness, exhaustion, and injury from labor. Each thaw brings a long journey where letters get lost and the right people are late. In such an environment, flesh is not about sweetness, but a resource for survival. A weakened body ruins routines, disrupts service, leads to fines and lost rent. That is why the plays where adult heroines defend the freedom of the body as a frontier sound like a branch of economic ethics. Not to let coercion masquerade as beneficence, not to sign patronage at the price of silence, not to exchange the honor of the community for a brief benefit. In the medicine notebook, next to prescriptions for woodchuck, sage, and vinegar for washings, lies a list of readings for young sisters. It is no accident that these two sheets are adjacent. They treat the same thing: the ability to live under pressure without disintegrating. On the larger map of the empire, manuscripts go beyond the walls. The imperial house needs educated writing that embraces not only the annals of marriages and campaigns, but also the moral order. An abbey with privileges is part of this machine, preserving memory, teaching chant and grammar, hosting noble pilgrims, transcribing texts for the court. The canoness's plays are placed in this stream as a tool for speaking order, useful wherever one has to keep the house uncluttered. They are honored for their clarity. In place of ambiguity is the construct of choice. In place of fairground innuendo is the straightforward thesis that consent is the condition of any union. In place of the seduction of the stage body is the figure of the adult heroine, whose freedom is confirmed by deed and price. Court guest lists note evenings where manuscripts were read in a close circle, not for entertainment, but as part of education. This does not negate the danger. Any conversation about flesh can be turned against the author, declared obscenity by the fact of the topic. But the Abbey prepares a defense in advance. The prefaces fix the purpose. The genre marker emphasizes the example of martyrdom, and the lists of donations lie nearby, a sign that the house is held not on scandal, but on trust. Critics, meanwhile, are picking up on a weakness: the form of theater. Spectacles have long been considered suspect in canon law, and it is easy for detractors to declare any scene fair. They invoke ancient prohibitions, recall the perniciousness of laughter, and the examples of ancient plays where desire was turned into play. But the document pulls the conversation back down to the facts. First, the texts in the women's house are arranged as readings, not public performances. The manuscripts contain no remarks on the square, only the structure of the roles for clarity. Sometimes chants are attributed, but no dances or masks. Second, the heroines are adults, and their decision is a defense of freedom, not a game of temptation. Third, the scenes are tied to the discipline of the statute. They are accompanied by fasting, prayer, and instruction. Their function is to keep order, not to excite. Fourth, the household lists note that before the reading, candles and oil are expended, and after the reading, the record of donations for the poor increases, a sign that the texts generate a specific act rather than a crowd. This is not a beauty argument, it is a management report. The turn comes where the manuscripts reach the court. There are people sitting in the king's chancery who are used to turning over books for profit and threats. They see that the plays of the canoness do not give the crowd cause for spectacle. There are no naked bodies, no square battle of the sexes, no buffoonish lines that strike at the honor of the race. But there is instruction on resisting coercion, suitable for women's houses and courtly unions alike. Against the backdrop of political marriages, where adult women find themselves in difficult positions, such language proves useful. It explains how not to give consent under duress, and how to protect the home without making a fuss. The manuscripts receive quiet recognition, not enthusiastic, but economic. This is evident in small things: the list of gifts to the abbey, the record of the grant of parchment for the continuation of the writings, the name of the scribe from the court school to whom a copy was given. The conflict does not disappear. In ecclesiastical circles, they argue about the propriety of the genre. Some believe that the form itself is dangerous, and any mention of flesh encourages temptation. Others reply that silence is worse, because it leaves evil without a tongue, and evil loves silence. The letters of the episcopal schools sometimes sound the alarm. The female voice from the abbey must not affect the world outside the walls. But here, too, the document keeps the myth from taking root. The library catalogue lists texts by the Church Fathers, treatises on grammar and history. The canonist manuscripts stand side by side as part of the discipline, not as sweet poison. The statutes note the right of the canonesses to lead instruction. The donation lists include the names of the princes who sent candles and books. The housekeeping book includes a line about repairs to the cloister that leaked last winter. This bookkeeping puts out the fire. A house where the theater is part of the order does not look unseemly. From within, the plays work as an antidote to the language of lust. Where aggressive power tries to make shame a tool, the heroine calls things by name. Coercion is sin and disorder. Consent is the condition of all union, not artistic naturalism, but a legal and spiritual vocabulary. Not savoring pain, but recording the consequences: excommunication, fine, banishment. This does not undo the reality of cruelty, disease, death from fevers and wounds. On the contrary, it intensifies the disturbing background. In a world where adult women carry the household and the honor of homes, language that calls freedom of the body a duty of conscience becomes an instrument of survival. It is valued where they know how to count. So slowly, the bridge from the cloister to the throne room takes shape. The women's text does not ask for favor, it offers service to order. To opponents, this sounds like a quibble. They still see flesh in the subject matter and pull the label of obscenity. For defenders, it's an argument about the economy of the body and institutions of control. If language leaves the flesh to the enemy turns it into a tool. Canonissa does otherwise. It returns the adult woman's body to the status of boundary and the scene to the status of moral enclosure. The document holds this thesis together. Manuscripts are dated, lists are checked, expense inventories are meticulous. What follows will show how the court's dispute over the propriety of genre collides with utilitarian calculation, and how the final confession is formalized without fanfare. The canonesses will find the theater moral and useful because it teaches them to keep consent away from coercion, and in this way it protects the home better than any loud sermon. The court lists record the days on which wrappers came from the abbey. 8 or 10 sheets, tightly bound with ribbon, marked as belonging to the women's house and bearing the name of the scribe. In one such bundle lay a chronicle of the sovereign's deeds, compiled to strengthen the memory of the dynasty. In another were dramas, arranged according to ancient standards, but for a different purpose. The court library worked as a customs house of meanings. Books were accepted, leafed through, tried on for the needs of the house and court. The adult court ladies in charge of education saw in the plays of the canonissa a tool against coercion and gossip. Scenes where adult heroines refused patronage at the cost of their bodies became a lesson in how not to let shame become a weapon. The men in charge of order found it utilitarian. Fewer outbreaks of scandal, less cause for slander, less risk that private cruelty would go up in smoke. But there were those who did not like the form itself. They called the theatricality dangerous, recalled the old prohibitions on spectacle, and insisted that the subject of flesh was itself a boundary. The conflict was formalized without shouting, on paper. In some letters, they wrote that the female voice was out of bounds. In response, they received prefaces emphasizing the pedagogical purpose and the strict statutory outline of the reading. The very fabric of the plays left no room for ambiguity. There was no street clowning, no body scene, no buffoonish line where evil could be swallowed under laughter. The adult characters operated in a space of law and vow, which in the women's house was understood as a duty to God and community. Where an overbearing character abused force, the text recorded this as a social fact, a threat, a discredit, an attempt at coercion. Where the house risked turnover and honor, consequences were indicated: fines, excommunication, loss of trust, breaking of alliances. The internal tension of the plays was built on the struggle between two economies, pleasure and order. Canonissa, parsing the language of antiquity, changed the poles. The body ceased to be a commodity, turning into a boundary of consent, and the stage from entertainment to a moral barrier. In the convent catalogue, a note next to the title of a play sometimes read, "For instruction," and it sounded like a seal. The document put a dot where the myth of female indecency expected a comma. The scriptorium worked like an auditor. The scribe left dry traces. When the parchment was issued, how many candles it took, who checked the cleanliness of the margins, which hand added the red initials. In the margins, in the same handwriting, there was a disclaimer that the action was intended to be read within the community or to adult guests in the ruler's house, without a square, without masks or dancing. This was a prearranged defense against the label of spectacle. A related item can be found in the household book: expenses for oil and candles for readings, records of donations after feasts, a note that a theologian from the palace school sent a glossa praising the clarity of the fabula. So drop by drop an argument was formed where everything was held together by little things, not a slogan, but a list, not emotion, but balance. The medical reality of the 10th century gave this theater a second nerve. The adult women within the abbey walls, like the women in the houses of nobility, lived under the pressure of hardships, winter fevers, exhaustion from fasting and labor, long journeys through the damp, injuries from hard work. Healers wrote down prescriptions for herbs against pain and for vinegar lotions, and nearby lay sheets of reading for strengthening, plays where the body was returned, respect as a condition of service. This was not sentimentality, it was risk management. Denial deprived the evil of controlling someone else's body. The Abbey's chronicle juxtaposed strange pairings: the day the potion chest arrived, and the day the play for young canonesses was read; the day an official arrived with a rent demand, and the day an excerpt from the drama was shown at court. The leaves looked like false coincidences, but they made up a system. Care for the body was juxtaposed with language that did not give the body away. On a large-scale map of politics, the plays proved to be bricks in a wall of legitimacy. The canoness also compiled a chronicle of the sovereign, careful, leveled to the needs of the dynasty, where victories and treaties were linked to piety and order. This did not cancel the dramas, but explained their place. The women's house supported not only with prayer and chanting, but also with language that rewired the society with the nerve of concord. For the court, it was profitable. For the opponents, disturbing. In the correspondence of the theologians, there were reminders of ancient prohibitions against spectacles and the harm of laughter in sacramental matters. On the other hand, the city's statutes, which forbade humiliating bodily trials in the courts, already touched a modern nerve. The adult body was not the currency of public authority. The theater of the Canonissa picked up on this, albeit without calling it by such words. The stage does not touch the body. The stage builds boundaries. Then came a twist that solidified a new mode of reading. One court tutor, fearing the indecency of the genre, demanded a ban on plays as a form. The abbey responded with a set of documents where everything already lay in the right boxes: statutes authorizing instruction, household records showing discipline at home, glosses from the court school attesting to the educational benefits, a colophon where the scribe noted that the plays were intended to be read by adults and for an emphatically honest purpose. The dispute, which began as a question of flesh, ended in an accounting in which women's theater became part of the tools of the world. It was convenient to the court, less occasion for rumor, clear language of refusal, discipline of forms. The tutor remained in his opinion, but he did not achieve a ban. On the contrary, the plays received a quiet "aloud" in the circle of grown-up ladies and court teachers. Through all these papers, one can hear the voice of the epoch with its hard prose. Power strokes and beats. Diseases eat up strength. Roads break people. Sudden death is always near. In such a world, the choice of words is as much a matter of survival as the grain supply. Hrotsvitha has found a form in which the female voice is not silent or playful. It names a boundary and makes it usable for home and yard. Her plays are not at war with the body, but unlabel it as a commodity. They do not substitute public discipline for scandal, but gather it into scenes that can be raised in the cloister and in the admonition hall without sacrificing honor. The document holds this better than any legend. Catalogs, consumables, prefaces, colophons, gift lists. And beyond that, when the dispute over the propriety of the genre pulls in new opponents, the defense will be the same, not speechy, but clerical. Texts will survive in this system because they are necessary. They reduce the number of bad decisions when someone else's power and someone else's body are on the table. Court correspondence accumulated subtle but hard signals by which to gauge the pressure on the genre. One year, a list of dangerous forms came to the chancery, where stage readings within the walls of houses stood alongside fairground carnival games. Another year, a university school rewrote a scheme of what was allowed, where the place of the stage was not named at all, as if the genre was dissolving into thin air. The abbey did not argue in words, it worked on paper. Colophons were affixed to the margins of manuscripts, where the designation for readings within the community or in a small circle of adult guests put an invisible grid around the text. In the prefaces, a formula for instruction was repeated, and each scribe confirmed it by hand. Thus, the scene became not a square, but an element of the statute, and the statute in the empire weighed more than the passions. The household sheets reflected this dryly. Talk of prohibition hit donations sharply and delayed the importation of candles. The calming of disputes brought stability back to supplies. The court saw the correlation, and that was the main argument in favor of keeping the readings. Within the plays, meanwhile, the contours of the body economy were intensifying. The adult heroines, without becoming models of ascetic unattainability, acted as practitioners, avoiding private negotiations where consent was easily substituted for patronage, calling witnesses, adjudicating in the space of rules. Violence was talked through as an abuse of power with consequences for the house, loss of reputation, diminished creditworthiness, the danger of confiscations under the guise of piety. The plays did not paint brutality in strokes, but recognized its presence as a climate from which discipline guarded against. The outside world resonated with this discipline as well. Prohibitions against humiliating bodily trials and nightly purifications without evidence crept into city statutes, and a line appeared in court notebooks that description of an adult's condition did not equal proof. The theater of the canonissa lived in the same ecology, the body under care and right, not under contempt and display. The most heated round of the dispute over propriety occurred when several scribes from the schools at the men's monasteries demanded that plays be removed from courtly use to avoid temptation. The abbey responded not by complaining, but by demonstrating the procedure. A set was drawn up in which everything lay in its place. The abbey's charter, with a clause on adult instruction. Inventories of candles and oil tied to the seasonal readings. The names of the adult ladies in the ruler's entourage who attended the readings. Glosses by a university theologian praising the clarity of the morals. Colophons where scribes recorded the purpose. And, separately, a statement of donations for the poor raised after the readings. Attached to the set were excerpts from a chronicle compiled by the same hand, where the nexus of piety and order was presented as the state norm. There was no outcry, there was an archive, and it was this archive that moved the dispute from the realm of feeling to the realm of accounting. The genre remained under the cover of the statute, read by adults, useful to the world, and did not become a spectacle. At the same time, a hard winter was underway, and the medical background, as always, squeezed out a new grittiness in the texts. The medicine men recorded another rise in fevers, rubs from dampness, and frostbite in the workers. Next to the prescriptions were reminders of readings assigned to reinforce discipline. The adult women in the plays refused coercion, not for the sake of abstraction, but for the sake of keeping the house in working order. Consent was called what it was, the free decision of the individual on whom the service schedule, the keeping of keys, and the order of the pantry depended. Those who demanded covering the subject of the flesh, could present no alternative but silence. Silence, however, turned into an upsurge of private abuses reported by the same household books: rent delays, quarrels, rumors, falling donations. In this ledger, victory remained for a language that linked bodily freedom to duty rather than market lust. At court, the practice of quiet approval was taking shape. Instead of a formal decree, a sequence of small actions. Library lists recorded the regular renewal of copies. Court schools passed glosses where plays were included in lists of useful to read alongside hagiographies. The patroness of an abbey sent parchment to a woman's house for the continuation of writings. Donation books grew to record donations of books and cloth. These signs of foundation were recognition, only without fanfare. Those who feared the obscenity of the genre retreated to the boundary of let it be, but not beyond the circle of adults, and on that boundary the theater could hold. The condition sounded like a formula of safety. No square, no masks, no scenes with bodily demonstration, with a fixed moral purpose, under the supervision of the statutes and elders. The canoness herself pushed this balance with her chronicle of the sovereign. The text, assembled carefully and with an eye to the court, drew a line where piety was the cement of union and order the form of survival. Chronicles, dramas, and hagiographical scenes lay like tiles of the same path. A language that could keep people from making bad decisions without humiliating the body. The adult reader saw it not as a soft moral, but as an instruction manual for a time where mistakes cost blood and bread. That's why the canoness's plays began to disappear on private lists of obstacles for which one should refrain from spectacle. They didn't fall under suspicion because they didn't give the crowd what the crowd asked for. They returned the discussion to the rules room. To prevent the conversation from turning into apologia, it is important to record the dark sides. There have been cases of scribes deliberately omitting lines or softening wording for fear of local jealousy. There have been attempts to put plays on lists of undesirable texts at the level of individual schools. And there have been abuses of power where an influential person pressed authority by demanding the removal of the feminine word from the reading list. These facts do not require color. They are registered as social damage, leading to censorship losses and short-term failures in donations. But even here, the defense mechanism worked. The abbey kept duplicates, sent copies to neighboring houses, corresponded with the court, and ensured that the colophons and statutory formulas remained in place. In the long distance, it is not loudness that survives, but the repetition of form. The finale was formalized not by decree, but by habit. In court manuscript lists, the canonissa plays continued to appear alongside hagiographies and chronicles as part of readings for adults. In the colophons, scribes left the same formulas of appointment for instruction within the community and the narrow circle without a square or bodily demonstration. In the abbey's household books, the lines about candle and oil for readings ran evenly, and next to them, donations for the poor, steady, without the failures that scandal usually brings. The medicine notebook still contained prescriptions for fever and pain, and beneath them, a list of readings assigned to strengthen discipline. Where prohibition had been sought before, routines now worked. The residual controversy over the propriety of genre shrunk to a pedagogical caveat. Read to adults, keep the uniform without masks or dancing. Hold the line where the adult body remains a matter of care and law, not stage and shame. A few schools continued to wrinkle their foreheads over the topic of flesh, but their objections dissolved into accounting. The house, where the stage does not feed the crowd, but gives language for the refusal of coercion, economized on conflict and disruption, which pleased the court, the town, and the abbey, which had to manage through cold and sickness. The canoness's plays are anchored in a useful zone, not fair not street taunting, not sweet poison, but a carefully assembled tool that brings back to words the boundaries of consent and responsibility. The document defeated the myth not by loudness, but by repetition. Library catalogs fixed titles next to serious books. Colophons repeated the purpose. Charters confirmed the right to instruct. Gift lists showed the loyalty of the court. Treasury notebooks knew not the waves that prohibition brings. Letters from patrons contained dry notations on vellum for continued writings. In such a field, the legend of female silence did not bear the weight of paper. We have before us an author whose word moved the conversation about the body from the realm of innuendo and voluptuous jokes into the realm of order, consent, and responsibility. And the legend of the obscene theater also receded. A text without naturalism and without a stage body did not give rise to fairground anger, but to a language of refusal, which is needed by houses and courts. The shadows of time are also heard in this summary. Abuses of power were encountered. Manuscripts were sometimes abridged. Scribes feared jealousy. Disease broke people. Roads were washed away by rain. But it was in this landscape that the discipline of form and economic prudence proved more useful than shouting. The theater of the Canonissa did not promise the triumph of desire or the humiliation of the enemy. It offered a way to survive the pressure without surrendering the body to a foreign rhetoric. Within the boundaries drawn by Charter and Colophon, her scenes taught adults to avoid transactions in which shame works as an instrument of coercion and to keep the house quiet. Such an outcome doesn't feel like a triumph, but it is sustainable. The plays live on where the word is heavy with print, and print economizes on trouble. This is how Women's Theater Against Lust entered the archives as a moral reading, not a reason to ban it. The final formula is simple and rigid. Freedom of the body is a duty of conscience. Consent is a condition of any union. Coercion is a social harm with consequences. The document retained this formula through charters, catalogs, ledgers, and colophons. And so the final confession looked not like a parade, but like a line in a schedule. Reading, after service, in the cloister, for adults. Purpose, strengthening of borders. Form, no square. Benefit, quieter nights, fewer rumors, smoother gatherings. At this point, the story closes without fanfare. The author remained in books, not in legends, and her scenes continue to work wherever the house order needs words stronger than myths.